All right, so we've become very familiar with our 3D primitive shapes by now. What I want to do next is introduce you to our spline primitive objects. And so these are spline shapes, and splines are just like paths in Illustrator or After Effects or Photoshop. The only thing is splines are 3D. So just like in Photoshop, Illustrator, we have all these shape presets. You can see rectangle, circle, cogwheel, a lot of other cool little preset objects here. And just like all of the individual 3D objects, depending on which spline object you choose, you'll have your own unique object properties, just like the 3D primitive objects. So if I were to create a talk bubble icon, what I would do is I would first grab a rectangle, and then what you can do is you can see all the object properties down here in the object tab. You can see the width and the height. You can also activate the rounding here and adjust the radius here. So that's looking nice. And again, we have a 3D path, aka a spline. And there we go. We have these options here. Now, if I wanted to create the little pointy bit down here, what I would do is go back into my spline preset menu. And so there's a couple ways to create a little pointy bit. You can grab an end side, and basically an end side, again, has its own unique properties here. We have a radius, we have the sides, so you can create like a pentagon or a hexagon, or you can create a flat line here with just the sides of 2, or you can create a triangle using 3 sides. So you'll note in our menu here, there's no like triangle preset or anything like that. You could use a star, and again, star has its own unique properties here too. And you can adjust the points down to say 3, and then just adjust this so the sides here are a little bit of line. But there's one thing here that the star preset doesn't have, and that is the ability to have some rounding. So if I turn on the rounding on the end side, you can see now we can have this like rounded triangle, which will match the rounding of our rectangle here. So as you get familiar with all these different spline objects, you get to know when you could use what spline object for what purpose. So I'm going to delete the star object there, and then I'm going to grab this end side, and I'll just move this down on the YX plane here by clicking and dragging on this 3D plane handle right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this by hitting the R key, and then I'm going to rotate this along the Z-axis here, so hovering over that Z-axis band, and I'm going to hold the Shift key down to constrain in increments of 5 degrees, and I'm just going to move that negative 30 degrees. And I'm going to hit T for scale, and just scale this down a little bit, E for move, and move this on this 3D plane here. And the one thing I don't want to do is move this back or forward in the Z plane, and I'll show you why in just a bit. But you can see, all right, I got that position there. Maybe I'll make this width a little bit longer there. So if I wanted to combine these two splines together, if this were Illustrator, you would use what's called the pathfinder to combine two paths together to create a new singular path. Well, in Cinema 4D, there is something similar to the pathfinder, and it is called a spline mask. And it is in this green generator menu here. So green objects mean that they are generator objects, and generators are a very special kind of Cinema 4D object that allows you to generate new geometry based off of what you feed into it. You can see that we've been working with these blue objects. So anything blue also designate that it's a certain type of object. And blue means that it's a parametric object, which means that it's an object with adjustable parameters, as we've been, adjusting all these different parameters here. So green is generator, allows you to generate new objects based off of what you feed into it. And blue objects are parametric, which means it has its own adjustable parameters. So if I go and I grab a spline mask, again, this is your Cinema 4D version of the Pathfinder in Illustrator. I can go and add that, and you can see, again, it's green. And if I wanted to combine these two objects together, you can see in the spline mask, the object properties here, by default, the mode's set to union, and the axis is default to XY, which is this axis here, which is exactly the plane that we want to combine these two splines together. So again, a generator object requires you to feed other objects into it. And when I mean feed other objects into it, I mean make these two objects, or any object, a child of the generator object. So to do that, I'm going to click and drag to get this rectangular selection, select these two spline objects here, and then to make these objects a child of the spline mask and combine them together, I'm just going to click and hold down my mouse until I see the spline mask highlighted, and you can see that arrow pointing down. Now watch right here, because when I release my mouse and make these two objects a child of the spline mask, boom, it just created a new spline based off of the splines that we fed into it or made a child of that spline mask. Now, again, this is basically your Pathfinder. So the thing that makes the spline mask better than the Pathfinder is that this is all live. So when you execute a Pathfinder command in Illustrator, you're just kind of left with an object, and you really can't adjust those two objects unless you use compound paths or something like that. And in Cinema 4D with the spline mask, I can move this still, and this is all live. Again, you don't want to move this on the Z axis here because you can see what's going on there. If I move that forward, we get this really janky spline now. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo that. And if you want to make sure that everything is aligned, just make sure you select your objects and make sure on the Z axis, they're at 0 centimeters. So you can see the inside, 0, rectangle, 0. If any of these are off, you can see all that weirdness. So I'll just zero out the Z position there. And so we can go to our spline mask, go to the object tab. You can see all these different modes. Again, just like Pathfinder has a bunch of different modes as well. You have A subtract B. So A is your first object. B is your second object. So if I go A subtract B, we're subtracting B from A. So you can see we're subtracting the rectangle from that end side and we're left with this. B subtract A means we're subtracting A from B. So we're subtracting the end side from the rectangle. And then you got and, which kind of just an intersection, or, and then intersection, which really isn't doing anything. But we're going to go with union right now. And so the one thing to note is when you use generator objects and say you want to select that end side to move it, if I select here, you would think that I would be able to select that end side, but I'm actually selecting the spline mask because what we see in the viewport is the result of the spline mask. So if you want to select the individual end side or the rectangle, you can't do it in your viewport. You have to do it in your object manager. Okay. So the end side, I'll select that. I can move this around and T for scale, scale that up. Again, this is really lovely that it's all live here and parametric. So if I wanted to create those little dots that are typically in speech bubbles, what I could do is go back to my spline menu here, grab a circle, hit T for scale, scale this down, hit E for move. I can command click and drag to move this over to the left. Command click and drag, move this over to the right, hold the shift key down to move in increments of 5 centimeters. I can select all 3 of these circles, scale these down a little bit. There we go. Now, at the end of the day, this is just a 3D spline, and this actually doesn't render at all. So splines by themselves, if I would go to render to picture viewer, again, this is all black. So just like if you were an illustrator and you just created a path and you didn't apply a stroke to it, it's not going to generate any imagery. So that's kind of where we're at right now. But we can generate geometry with this using other types of generator objects that are in this generator menu here. So let's generate some geometry based off of these splines. So I'm going to dive back into my generator menu here, and I'm going to grab an extrude. So an extrude is your most basic modeling command. If I go and add that to my scene, remember if we want to generate geometry or generate new objects based off of an extrude object, we need to throw them into the extrude object here. So I'll click and drag, get a rectangular selection, and I will click and drag, make them a child of the extrude. And you will see that voila, we have some geometry here and one circle got extruded here. So if I go to my extrude object here, let's just kind of dive into some of the settings here. You can see we have the offset, which is basically just how far out this is extruded either positively or negatively here. So I'll just go negative a little bit. We don't really have to worry about these just yet. But the one thing we want to pay attention to is why is this only extruding the one circle? So it's only extruding this first circle in our child hierarchy here. So if I go to extrude, in this hierarchical option here, if I check this on, it's actually going to extrude all of the spline objects that are underneath this extrude object or a child of this extrude object. So I can have multiple objects, as many splines as I want, and it will extrude all of them together. And they'll all share the same settings that we apply on this main parent extrude object. So if I go to the caps option here, so you can see both of these tabs are open at once. You can open multiple tabs by holding the shift key down and clicking. And so you can see I have my object properties and my caps properties all in one menu. And so you can see, just like cap options on your primitive objects, like your cylinder, all that stuff, we have that here as well. So we can adjust the rounding here and adjust the size. So you can see what that looks like there. A little bit of rounding there, maybe 1.2. And now let's go ahead and I'll just rename this to dots. We'll call these the dots. So dots extrude. And then what we can do is let's actually extrude this spline mask here. So remember, the spline mask is the result of these two spline objects that are fed into it. So we can actually fold this up. This will help us with treating this spline mask as a singular object. So another thing that will help us too is if I just change this to talk bubble spline mask. So we name that object appropriately. What we can do at this point is we can grab yet another extrude object here, and I can click and drag this spline mask and feed this into the extrude object or make it a child of this extrude. And now you can see that now, let's just rename this talk bubble extrude. And now you can see we have this extrude here. Same options here, adjust. We can adjust the rounding here, the caps rounding. We can even extrude and offset this a little bit more. And just like that, we have a nice talk bubble icon. Now, let's go a little bit further with this. So now what if I wanted to make this where I'm actually wanted to subtract these dots from the talk bubble and use yet another spline mask here? So we have a singular object instead of two separate objects. What we can do for that is let's first deactivate the extrude object so we're only seeing our splines again. And to do that, we can either click on this checkbox and make it an X. And if I do that on both of my extrudes, you'll see that it will just deactivate those extrudes and just allow us to see our splines. And you can see if I went and just turned off the spline mask, it would also deactivate the spline mask here. So you'd see both of our separate objects here. Another shortcut key, if I was clicking on my extrude here and I hit the Q key, it would also toggle that active or inactive. So now if I wanted to use all these circles and subtract it from this spline mask, what I would do is I would grab yet another spline mask. And what I would do is I would bring in these circles, make them a child of the spline mask. And with this set to union, you can see if I move these circles together, we're actually able to combine all these circles together, which is really interesting. So if I just go and undo that, because I didn't want to do that, but if I rename this to dots spline mask, again, to help us understand what's going to be going on here. And basically what I want to do at this point is I have my dots combined together with this spline mask, creating this spline with 3 dots. And I want to subtract it from this talk bubble spline mask. Let me just drag and drop this out from underneath this talk bubble extrude here. What we can do is do spline masks within spline masks and have spline mask inception. And I'm saying spline mask a lot. So let's go and get a spline mask. And what I'm going to do is use this spline mask to subtract this spline mask from this spline mask. How many times can I say spline mask? So let's go and I'm going to select these 2 spline masks, drag this under this spline mask. And you can see that because this spline mask is set to union, what I actually need to do is I actually want to subtract A from B. So that's why I'll choose this B subtract A. So we'll be subtracting the dots from the talk bubble. And now if we go and drag this underneath an extrude object, turn on the extrude, you can see exactly what we did. So here we are again. If I untwirl all of this, this is basically our main spline mask that combined these splines and these splines. And I can go in, again, this is all live. I can adjust the radius of the dots. I can adjust the end side here still too. And you'll see that this rounding is going to be applied to the result of all of these objects being combined under this single spline mask. So another thing we can do is we can go and select all these circles, command click and drag, and that'll duplicate the circles, bring these under the dots extrude, turn that back on. We can kind of have this little hole cut in here. And I can select this dots extrude, and I can move this back, or I can even select these circles and move these back as well. And you'll see that I'll bring the extrude back a little bit. And then what I can do is extrude the offset even more and go like this. And so now we have these dots kind of coming through and we have these kind of holes cut through this as well. So the round objects go in the round hole, and we got something looking pretty nice. So it's very helpful to name your objects so you know exactly what's going on. When you have multiple spline masks and you're combining different things together, just like if you're an illustrator and you're trying to do the same thing with compound paths and compound masks and all that kind of stuff, or even using shape layers and combining shape layers in After Effects, it's very helpful to keep everything nice and organized. But at the end of the day, we have these two extrude objects and a bunch of splines that we combined with spline masks. Right, so I just opened a totally new project because what I want to do is demonstrate how you can create splines other than using just these pre-made spline objects. Just like in Illustrator or Photoshop or After Effects, all of the Adobe things, they have their own pen tools, and so does Cinema 4D. It's got its own pen tool, and it acts very similarly to how the pen tool works in all those other Adobe software. So you can find the pen tool right here. What I'm going to do is select that. It's called the spline pen. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click in my viewport, and I'm just going to click once, and you can see I'm building a spline. There's my spline object in the object manager. Now, if I click and hold, you'll see I'll get that Bezier handle and a smoother spline path there. And you can see I can click and drag, click and drag. If I just click once, that's a linear spline. And if I want to close the spline, I just hover over and you'll see that little circle there, and I can close that spline. Now, you'll see that the spline is color-coded. It goes from white all the way around to blue. Now, this just shows you where the start of the spline is, which is the white bit of the spline, and where the end of your spline is, which is the darkest blue here. Now, you'll notice as I'm like hovering over the spline, you'll see I'm highlighting different segments here. And this allows you, if you click and drag, to control two different Bezier handles at the same time. So I can select this Bezier handle and just edit one, or I can select this whole tangent here and adjust both Bezier handles at the same time. So this is very handy to be able to smooth things very quickly. If I even hover over here, it will actually change those linear handles to Bezier handles here. You can also do this by selecting a point, right-clicking, and going to hard tangents. That'll make it linear. I can go soft again. If I want to select multiple points at the same time, I can utilize my selection options here. So you'll see we got the brush selection, which if I select that, it's just this little brush here. You can change the size here, and I can select multiple points at the same time and move them around. I can select them and right click and go to soft interpolation or hard interpolation. You see whether they're linear or soft there. I can also go to my other selection tool, rectangular selection. I probably use this the most, and the shortcut key for that is 0. And so I can select all these points here. You can go to the lasso selection and yeehaw, lasso all those points, and then go to polygon selection, and you can create a polygon to select these points like so. Now, the shortcut keys for all of these, you can see at the bottom here what the shortcut keys for these options are. So brush selection is 9, rectangular selection 0, lasso is 8, and polygon selection is in the island of misfit tools that don't have a shortcut key. So unfortunately, you'll have to go into this menu or set your own custom shortcut keys. I typically use the rectangular selection, so typically I'll go with that, but at least you know that it's just 9, 0, and 8, okay? So I'm just gonna go back to my pen tool here. You'll see there is other pen tools here. So this is your polygon pen, and this draws polygons, not splines. You don't want to use that because that is not the pen tool. This is the pen tool. So make sure you are selecting the right thing here. It's the one with the little curve there. And what I can do is I can go and create a whole other spline here. And you'll notice that this added a second spline to this original spline object. So essentially we have two splines on this spline object, and typically you don't want to do that. Typically, if I undo this, Command or Control Z, typically you'll want to create a whole other spline object that you can go and do different things with. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I deselect that spline so no splines are selected, go back to my spline pen and create a new spline. And you'll see there's a second spline object there. And so what I can do here as well is I can go and I can hit escape to stop building that spline. If I want to continue on building, I'll again make sure I have my pen tool selected, select this point, and I can continue building the spline. I can also even continue building from this first point there by hitting escape and then just selecting that spline point, and I can continue building from that first spline point that we created. And Again, you know that's the first spline point because it's the white part of the gradient as it goes to the end of the spline, which is that darker blue. Now, if you want to select all points of a spline at once, I'm just going to hit the Command or Control A, and that will select all those spline points. I can go in here, go to soft tangents, and there you go. Now, if I select a point, I can adjust these Bezier handles independently here, which is really, really nice. I can adjust this as I please here. And I can add more points to this spline, like say right here, by holding the Command or Control key down. You'll see that little line, and that will allow me to just add points. Now, if I want to add points on another spline, I just got to make sure I select that spline and hold the Command or Control key down and start clicking. So you go the spline pen basics. The last thing I want to show you is that when you use the spline tool, you are automatically going to be put into point mode. And what point mode is allows you to select points. There's an edge mode, there's a polygon mode, and by default, what we've been doing is working in the entire time in this model mode. And what model mode allows you to do is simply select objects. If I go to my move tool here, allows you to select objects in your viewport as a whole. Okay, so this does not allow you in this model mode to edit spline points. So to be able to edit those spline points again, I just need to make sure I'm in my point mode, or I can go back into my spline pen again, and this will allow me to, again, adjust these points and Bezier handles, and that will automatically bring me into the point mode. So Cinema 4D is very intuitive with its spline pen and how the spline pen works. And again, if you're used to working with the pen tool in any other Adobe products, you will feel right at home using the pen tool in Cinema 4D. Now, the one last tip I want to share with you is that you will never want to, you'll never want to just build splines in your perspective view, because you can see that we're kind of building things at an angle here. Typically, you'll want to go and start building splines in any one of your flat views here. So typically I will go and maximize the front view here, and I'll get my pen tool. And if I just start clicking and dragging here and creating a little blobby shape, you can see that when I go to my perspective view, this is a very flat, this is perfectly flat spline. Now, if you wanted to start editing this and giving this spline some depth, this is where you'll start using all of your different 3D views here. So like your top view, you can see what that looks like. Now, if you want to adjust these Bezier handles and have them maintain the same length, you can go to the spline pen options menu over here, and you can say lock tangent length. And what this will do is it will lock the length there. You can also lock the rotation, so you can only adjust the length of the Bezier handles. And you can also have it where it just creates new splines every time you go and add a new spline to that view. So you don't have that issue of accidentally having a spline selected and you're adding another spline to that same spline object. So pay attention over here. Whenever you select a new object, there will be specific options in your attributes manager that you should pay attention to. Of course, you can change the different types of splines that you can make by default. So you can by default use the linear pen and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to delete all these spline points. And now that you kind of have the hang of using the pen tool, let's actually start making something with it. So just like we use the extrude object to generate geometry based off of a spline, I'm going to show you some other helpful generator objects that can help you generate geometry from splines in different ways. So if we're in the generator menu here, you can see there is our extrude that we've been using, and right next to it is the lathe object. So a lathe is a type of generator that rotates a spline along the y-axis, and you can use this for many types of objects like modeling a soda bottle or a plant pot, or in our instance, we can use it to model a tea kettle. So let's first begin by making the profile of the teapot using a spline. So when using a lathe object, you're going to almost always want to create the spline that you're going to use for the lathe in the front view, so you're building the spline along the XY plane. So let's go to our 4-up view and just maximize the front view, or we can just simply hit F4 and that will bring us to our front view. And you can see here we are in our XY plane. So we can build out that spline flat. Now I'm just gonna reorientate here by hitting the 1 key and panning. And so what I'm gonna do, let me just grab the doodle tool so I can just sketch out what we're gonna be doing here. So if I wanted to create a tea kettle, it's gonna be kind of like a roundish tea kettle, like so. Now, I'm sorry for the terrible drawing. I think I had too much coffee today. And we'll create like a little lid, like so. Looks like it's melting, but never mind that. So when we're using a lathe object, we're basically going to rotate the spline along the y-axis 360 degrees. So what that means is we only need to build half of this spline, half of the profile shape, and then rotate it around to generate that geometry. Okay, so let's quickly delete that terrible drawing. I apologize for that. And I'm just gonna grab my spline pen tool. So again, we only need to build half of this profile of the tea kettle. So I'm gonna start at the bottom here and I can start clicking and dragging. And you can see I'm not perfectly aligned along the y-axis here. So when lathing an object, you wanna make sure you don't have like a hole in the bottom of your tea kettle by not having this first spline point perfectly aligned down this axis. So I'm going to undo that and I'm going to turn on snapping so I can snap to the work plane in my viewport here. So I accidentally just clicked there. So if I go to my snapping menu here, it's this little magnet here. And if I go to the menu next to it with the gear, this is basically, okay, what do you want to snap to? And so you can define that and check on work plane in the grid. And so when I click anywhere, you can see now I am going to be able to snap to the work plane and the grid that's in my viewport. So if I click and drag here, you can see that I am snapping to that point there. And I can click and drag here and I'm snapping to that point. Now at this point, I don't need to snap any longer. I don't need the snapping. So I can Shift S to deactivate the snapping. And I'm going to break this Bezier handle right here by holding the Shift key down and clicking and snapping that. It's better with sound effects. And then I can continue drawing the rest of my tea kettle. Okay, so that's a good profile spline right there. We'll worry about adding the thickness in just a bit. But if I go and I hit escape to finish that spline, let's see what this looks like when we throw this into a lathe. So I'm going to go to my generators menu here, grab a lathe, and remember we're going to make this spline a child of the lathe object for the generator object to act upon the spline. So I'll click and drag that spline, highlight the lathe object, make sure that arrow is pointing down, release my mouse, and you can see some stuff happen. So let's actually go to our 4-up view, and in our perspective view, we can now see we are generating some geometry based off of that spline. So you can see how the lathe object just went and rotated that spline around and generated geometry. So if we select the lathe object here, you can see if we adjust this angle, what's going on. Okay, so this is just 0 degrees to 360 degrees. And at 360 degrees, you got that closed geometry. So this is looking good. And so we can go into our spline here and select these points still. I'm going to select that point, hit E to get the move tool and move this around. And so it's always nice when you're kind of building a spline and you have the lathe object active. It's nice to have both your front view and your perspective view up at the same time. So we really don't need these other 2 views here. So what we can do is make it so we have 2 views up at the same time. And we'll go to Panel, Arrangement, and we'll do 2 views side by side. And here we have our perspective view, but then we have the top view over here. So to change the top view to our front view, we can just go to Cameras and Front. And now we have our front view and our perspective view up at the same time. So now we can adjust things and see exactly what this geometry is going to look like. Now you'll notice when we shrank our view down, our front view down, it's kind of hard to see both our points of our spline and the actual spline itself. So what I want to do is show you some preferences we can change to thicken up both the spline and points in our viewport. So I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, or Control E, and then go to Viewport Display. And here we can change the size of the point, the size of a selected point, and the spline thickness. So if I up this, you can see this is much more visible now. We can also change the size of the points and the selected point size. So now you can see those points very big. Maybe that spline's a little too big, but now this is much more clear where my points are and where my spline is. So I can close out the preferences here and we can continue working on this teapot here. So if I wanted to round out this edge, because it's pretty sharp as we can see here, I can go and select this point right here, right click, and go to chamfer. And chamfer is basically a fancy way to say rounding. So I'll go to chamfer and I'll click and drag in my viewport, and you can see how we're rounding everything out. Now you can see this Bezier handle's a little poked out there, and you can see there's this little bulge in our geometry. So I'm just going to go ahead and get out of my chamfer tool and go back into my spline pen by clicking and holding on this little UI element here and go into spline pen, or I could just click on the spline pen again and just clicking this little tangent here. I can also move this point as well. It's actually helpful if I can snap this to the x-axis here so I'm not going through the floor. So let me undo that and Shift S, and I can snap this to the ground there, and I can adjust this Bezier handle like so, and then Shift S to turn off snapping. So we got this nice rounded edge here. Now let's go ahead and let's create some thickness so this isn't such a thin walled tea kettle. So to do that, I'm going to select all of my points, and I can do that by making sure my spline's selected and hitting Command or Control A. And you'll see that all of my points are now selected. And at this point, I can right click and go to create outline. Now, what this will do, if I click and drag, you can see that I'm growing or contracting this spline and generating a little bit of thickness here. Now you can see there's a little bit of overlap there. We can fix that in just a little bit here, but this is looking really good. We added some nice thickness to our tea kettle here. So let's go ahead and let's hit E to get the move tool, and then I can zoom in and try to fix this issue right here. So for this, I'm just going to delete one of these points by selecting the point and deleting it, and I can select this point and just kind of move it up and kind of flatten this out. And so if I want to make sure that both this point and this point, if I hold the Shift key down to select this point and make sure that these are perfectly flush with one another, I can go to the coordinates manager here, and this is position and this is scale. And we want to scale this down on the Y, so there's no scale difference between these 2 points. Right now, there is a distance of 1.6852 centimeters between the two, but if I just hit 0 and enter, you'll see that now these are perfectly aligned, which is great. Now, you can also see that this spline is closed, and we actually don't need this spline to be closed right here, because if we look at the bottom, and if I select both of these points and I move this is actually like a closed mesh now. So I'm just going to go and undo that. And with the spline selected, I'm going to go to close spline and then just uncheck that altogether. And you're going to notice that some of our geometry just kind of went black, especially on the bottom there. And don't worry about that. That is just kind of a viewport glitch. If you rendered it, it's going to render just fine. But we got this nice tea kettle now. And I just want to demonstrate if these points weren't aligned perfectly down the y-axis. You can see how we got that hole through our geometry. So that's why we use that snapping there. So this is looking good. Let's go and round out the sharp edges that are right here. So to do that, we can select both of these points. And remember, we can right click and go to chamfer again, and we'll click and drag. And you'll notice something weird happens here. You can see that this chamfer actually flattened out this part of the spline. So I'm going to Command or Control Z to undo that. And instead of using the chamfer, I'm just going to manually round out these edges. And how I'm going to do that is making sure my spline's selected, make sure I'm in point mode, and then I'm going to hit Command or Control and hover over my spline. You can see that the cursor turns into all these little points, like the cursor gets all this acne for some reason. It's turning into a teenager. I'm just going to Command and click, and that will add a point to my spline that I can now manipulate. And now right now it is a linear spline. So I'm going to right click with that point selected and go to soft interpolation. And now we got those nice Bezier handles, and we can round this out. And this is looking really nice. A nice rounded lip to our tea kettle there. And at this point, we can do the same method to create the lid of our tea kettle. So let's rename some of these objects here. So this is tea kettle lathe. This is tea kettle spline. So let's make sure we deselect anything in the object manager by just clicking anywhere in the object manager. We'll go back to the pen tool. And again, we're going to start from the center axis here, the y-axis here. So we'll turn back on snapping. So remember, that is Shift S. And so we can snap right to that y-axis right there. And we'll create that point there, and then we don't need snapping anymore. So I'll hit Shift S, and so I'll click and drag. I'll hold the Shift key down, break that tangent, and click and drag, make a little lip right there. And then I want to snap back to the Y-axis here. So Shift S to turn back on snapping, and I'll just create that point. And then I can just go ahead and start adjusting. I'll go ahead and hit Shift S to disable snapping. And now I can start fine tuning this if I'd like, and make sure that you can see this little edge right here. This is where our spline is from our tea kettle. So you just want to align this spline with this edge right here. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to hit E to get the move tool, and I can start moving all these points around like so. And again, you shouldn't get too far just messing with the spline before you add the lathe. It's always helpful to see what the geometry looks like that'll be generated from this spline. So let's go and grab a lathe real quick, drag and drop the spline underneath it, make it a child of the lathe. You can see that this lid is a little tall, so I'll go and hit the 0 key to get my rectangular selection, or you can go up here and get all your different selection tools. And I'll select these 2 points, click and drag, and then just move this on down. And I can click and drag right here, move these points in, maybe move these down like so. And so now we got this nice lid. Hit the E key to get the move tool again, and just adjust this, hold the Shift key down and click to break the tangents and manipulate these individually like so. And now what if we wanted to actually shrink down or even scale up the lid and the mouth of this tea kettle? What if we wanted a wider mouth and a bigger lid? So what we can actually do is we can select 2 splines at the same time by holding the Command or Control key down and clicking that second spline. You can see that adds to your selection. And now I can go back to my rectangular selection tool, or I can grab like the lasso tool or polygon selection, whatever you want. I'll grab the rectangular selection tool again. And what I can do is click and drag to select all of these spline points here. And if I hit T to get the scale tool and click and drag, you can see I'm actually scaling from this axis center. But what I actually want to do is scale from the Y-axis here. So in this scale menu, you can actually offset where your axis is that you'll be scaling down from. So if I scale down from here, I can actually move this down here as well. And I can scale down from this axis center as well, or scale up. So this is one easy way to kind of tweak how wide the mouth of your tea kettle is. And I can E to get the move tool and move this up or down. And so there's a lot of precision with adjusting the modeling axis here. So I'm just going to set this back to default by right-clicking on the X and Y there to bring it back to its default value of 0. And you can see there is the default axis center, which again is just taking the average center of all of the points that are selected and just placing a axis center right in the middle of all those selected points. So I think this is looking pretty good. You can tweak this to your heart's content, of course, but I like what's going on here. Now, I just want to show you what's going on behind the scenes when you actually lathe an object, because if you notice, there's all of these little subdivision lines here. And basically, when you create a spline and generate geometry using a generator, what's going on if we look at this intermediate points here? What it's doing is the spline behind the scenes is creating intermediate points between your actual points that you can visibly see in your viewport. And it is creating those intermediate points to smooth out the geometry that is being generated by a lathe or an extrude or whatever that may be. So if I go to my display garage hitting lines, so we can see the lines in our viewport here. And these are all the edges that are being generated. You can see between this point and this point right there, all of those subdivisions, and that's coming from the intermediate points. And so adaptive is the default way it's creating intermediate points, and that is controlled by this angle. So if I have this angle raised up, you can see that the angle threshold is much higher, which means we don't have as much subdivisions. In fact, we don't have any subdivisions between this point and this point, or this point and this point, and that's why you are seeing just a flat edge here, just a flat piece of geometry. Now, if we bring this angle down, and we go to 0 degrees, you can see how much more subdivisions we're having. So let me just bring this up to 5 degrees here. And what's happening is that if at any point the spline line between this point and this point has an angle that is less than 5 degrees, it is going to create a subdivision. So if I up this to say 15, you can see we're getting even less points, but where we're getting the most amount of subdivisions, like right here, is where the angle between these 2 points is less than 15 degrees. So hopefully this is making sense. It's trying to create subdivisions without creating too much geometry. Because remember, the more subdivisions we have and the more segments we have, the heavier that geometry and the slower your scene will run. So it's just trying to optimize this view. And you can see right at the top here, where there is the biggest amount of curve, you're getting a lot more subdivisions here to smooth out that geometry. So there's a few different ways to create intermediate points. Number one, you can have none, which is literally just having a subdivision where every single point on your spline is. Now, if we change this to natural, what this is basically it's going to create 8 subdivisions, or whatever the number here is, between every point. So you can see between these 2 points up here, there will be 8 subdivisions. Between these 2 points, right here and right here, you'll see there are 8 subdivisions. And there will be 8 subdivisions between these 2 points, and then 8 subdivisions between these 2 points. Now, if I go to uniform, it's going to uniformly subdivide this no matter what the angle is. So if I up this a lot, you can see that these subdivisions are now evenly spaced throughout the geometry. If I go to adaptive, remember that's where we were before. You can see that it's adapting when there's no angle between 2 points, like right here and right here. It's not going to create these subdivisions that we see here. It's going to create a lot more subdivisions there. And if we go to the last one here, the subdivided, it's actually going to create subdivisions based on this angle threshold and this length threshold. So you can see that now we have all these subdivisions on the bottom, and it's basically spaced out every 5 centimeters. So if I bring this up a lot, so every 50 centimeters, you can see that every 50 centimeters, there's going to be a new subdivision, or if the angle is less than 5 degrees. So this is just ways to subdivide your geometry to, again, keep everything light and optimized, but typically adaptive is going to be just fine. Now, you'll notice that that is literally just creating subdivisions along the profile there, but what if you wanted to change the subdivision of the edges here vertically? Well, that's controlled in your actual lathe object. So this is actually looking kind of chunky. So what we can do is up the subdivision here, and that will add more subdivisions there. And we can go into our spline and add more subdivisions this way as well. So this is how you can get some nice smooth geometry. And I'll go back to display, garage shading, and you can see that we have some nice smooth geometry here on both our tea kettle top. Let me just name this our lid, Shift A to select all, Command and Control C to copy, and I'll paste this and just name that spline. So everything's nicely named there. I can maximize my view, and there is our nice tea kettle that we went and modeled using splines and lathe objects. So let's continue modeling our tea kettle, and what we can build next is the handle and the spout. So if I get my doodle tool here, I can draw the handle and then the little spout right here. So what we're going to do to build the handle and the spout is using yet another generator object. We use extrude, lathe. Next on our list is the sweep generator. And what the sweep generator does, and why it's going to be perfect for us to create the handle and the spout, is what it does is it uses 2 splines. One is a profile spline. You can see the little circle here. And what it does is it sweeps along a profile spline along another spline. So if we were to create this handle here, we would create a circle spline and throw that in a sweep, and then create the handle spline. And what the sweep object would do is sweep along that circle spline along the length of that spline that makes up our handle. And the same thing for the spout. If I were to draw a spline like this, and then sweep a little donut spline across it, we would create a nice little spout. So let's go ahead and let's delete this awful drawing, and let's grab our spline pen tool, and let's bring up our 2-up view by clicking this top right corner. And remember, we changed the arrangement here to the 2 views side by side, so that's why we're not getting our 4-up view anymore. But if you wanted to go up to your 4-up view, you could totally do that, but we're just going to use this front view And if you don't see front here, just go to cameras and front, and that will change this view to your front view. So let's use this front view to draw our spline. And what we're going to do is we are going to turn on snapping yet again. So we'll go to our snapping menu. And what we're going to do now is make sure we have point enabled as well. And this will allow you to snap, if I zoom in here, to these little points that make up the geometry here. And why I'm going to do that is I'm going to make sure that the beginning and end of the handle are both snapping to the same horizontal line on this geometry. So if I click and drag right here, create our first Bezier handle, and I'll snap to this work plane grid right here and click and drag. And then I'll follow this edge all the way over here and zoom in and click and drag to that point. And now we have our beginning and end of our spline on the same horizontal line here. So that matches. And I'm just going to go in. If I want to adjust these points, you're going to see that because I'm in the spline pen tool, it's going to try to close this spline. So I'm going to hit escape. And then what I'm going to do is go to my move tool. And this is where I can adjust these Bezier handles. And I'm just going to turn off the snapping by hitting Shift S. We're just coming up here and toggling the snapping on or off. And now I can adjust the Bezier handles here. And what you want to do is you want to utilize these grids here to try to match the Bezier handle here to the Bezier handle over here, so it kind of matches nicely. And you can eyeball this, but I'll bring up and maximize the front view. And if I select both of these spline points at the same time by holding the Shift key down and selecting this point, and again, making sure I'm still in this point mode, because if I'm in my model mode, I won't be able to select these points. So again, make sure you're in your point mode, and then you can try to match this Bezier handle, and you can see that something went wacky right there. I'm going to go to my pen tool again, and with these 2 points selected, I can try to match these Bezier handles on either side. So this is actually looking pretty dang close. And you can, again, use these grids and the wireframe down here to make sure that like everything matches. So something like that. Now I would say that's pretty darn close. And we can, of course, select this point right here and adjust this. I can go to my move tool and adjust the Bezier handles equally on either side. And I'd say that's looking good. So we have our spline. Let's rename this to handle spline. And now what we need to do is create the profile spline. So that profile spline can just be a circle spline. You can see that that spline's very, very big. So let's go ahead and let's shrink that down just for now. And then what we can do is let's grab our sweep object. So we'll grab the sweep object, and how this sweep object works is you need to feed in the profile spline first. So let's rename this profile circle. So now we can kind of keep track of what's what. And so let's drag and drop the profile spline in the sweep object, and you'll see nothing's happening. And that's because our sweep object needs two objects. So the profile, and then what is that profile going to be swept along? And it's going to be this spline right here. So I'll click and drag and make sure that arrow is pointing to the left and release my mouse, and voila, we have some geometry. We swept this circle along that handle spline. So again, this circle is a little bit too big, so we can shrink this down just a little bit, like so. And what we can do is we can actually just move the entire spline down here. So I can go into my model mode. So I'm selecting the entire object, and you'll see that the axis center is way down here. If I wanted this axis center to be kind of in the center of all of these spline points, or the bounding box of this spline, what I could do is just go in with that spline selected, go to Tools, Axis, Axis Center 2, and you'll see that that axis center will now snap to the bounding box of the actual spline here. So now we can move this down, and now we don't have these like gaps anymore that we had before. So we can just move this down. We can hit T for scale, scale this down as well, and that's looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and let's create our spout. So let's first rename this sweep to handle sweep. So everything's nicely named. And let's go back to our spline pen and just click and drag here and click and drag again. So this will just be a very simple spline like so. And I'll just hit escape to make sure it's not going to try to close that spline, and just adjust this and go back to my move tool, make sure I'm in my point mode. And now I can adjust this point as well without the spline pen trying to close the spline. And you'll notice I'm not able to select the Bezier handles here. And again, that is because we have two objects selected. So we just need to make sure just the spline we're trying to edit is selected, and this will allow us to adjust this Bezier handle. And this happens to me all the time where I'll be like, why can't I adjust the Bezier handle? And it's because you have two objects selected in your object manager. So easy mistake there. And so I think this is looking good. Let's create yet another sweep object. And so we'll grab our sweep object. Let's also grab yet another circle spline here, and we'll bring this down like so. And again, the order in which you're placing these objects in the hierarchy here is very important. So the circle spline first, the profile spline, and then the other spline. If you did this the other way, this would totally break, because now you're trying to sweep a single spline along the circle. Okay, so that's why we're getting this circle here. So the order is very important. The profile first. And if naming the profile helps you remember what's what, that's very helpful. So the profile spline first, and then the spout spline. Say that 5 times fast. And now we can go and adjust the circle here. Just that radius. And you can see that this doesn't have really a spout to it. So one thing we can do is in the circle spline, there's these two options, and you can have your ellipse where you can adjust the radius in the X or Y, or you can use a ring, which will give you this radius and then this inner radius here as well. So you can adjust this like so. And however thick you want your spout to be, you can totally do that. Let me rename this sweep to spout sweep. And the cool thing about the spout sweep is, what if we wanted to say taper the spout at the end here? Well, if you go and you select your sweep object and go to your object tab, right here, this might be folded up for you, but if you click and untwirl the details here, you will see this little scale and rotation spline graph. And what this allows you to do is adjust the scale of that profile spline along either the beginning of the spline or the end of the spline, which is really, really cool. So if I want to taper the end, I'll just drag this Bezier handle down like so. And I can adjust the handle here, and I can go and just command click to add another point. You can get whatever type of shape that you want. So that's really handy there. And this spout end is pretty sharp. So what we can do is, just like in your extrude object, you have those caps to add some rounding to the edges. You can do the same thing with the caps on your sweeps. So if I just go and adjust the size here, you can see that's adding some more geometry there and getting some really nice rounding at the end of our spout there. So that's looking really good. So one last thing I can do is I can go to my handle sweep here. And what if we wanted, say, like right here to be a thicker bit of the handle? Well, we can go again to our handle sweep, go to the object tab. And what we're going to do is we're going to get pretty nitty gritty inside of this little window here. And this window is very tiny. So one little trick for you, if you right click in this spline grid area, you can right click and go to show in separate window. And this will maximize that grid. So now we have all this space, which is super nice. And so now we can kind of get precision with where we're placing our points. So it's always nice to know like where along the spline you're putting points. So this is like 30% of the way and 70% of the way. So if we want to even things out on either side of the spline, we can command click, put a point here at 30% and then one at 70%. And so I can adjust here and here. But actually what I want to do is the other way, and hold shift and click and drag to get these rectangular selections. I'm going to move these points down. If you hold shift key, you're going to constrain to just being up or down. You can see how that's tapering the edges here. But I actually want to also go in here and command click here and bring these 2 points. So I'm going to select this point, hold shift, select this point as well, and then just bring these 2 points down, holding the shift key to constrain to just moving up and down. And now you can see if I click and drag to get that rectangular selection, just kind of line that up here. You can see we're kind of creating a nice little handle there. You can notice it's kind of chunky though. So what we can do is I can actually zoom into this graph just like we can zoom or pan in our viewport. So if I hold down the 2 key, I can zoom and 1 can pan. So I can move in here and really get precise and move this point over and try to fix that chunky edge there. I'll do the same thing over here. Try to get these points as close without having them snap to the other side there. So that's looking pretty good. And so there's still this chunkiness. So let me just close out of this spline window here and let's see what's going on. Now, remember there was the adaptive points that are helping us subdivide the geometry that's being generated by a generator object. And so if I select this handle spline here, remember the angle here? If we bring this down, we'll get more subdivisions, but you'll see that we actually need even more subdivisions. So let's go ahead and let's change this to subdivided. And so now we can go by angle and by distance. So if I go maximum length of 1 centimeter, you can see that added a whole bunch more subdivisions, and this made everything much more sharp than we did before. So we can up this a little bit. Maybe we can go 1.2. And so now we got a nice sharp edge, and you can see we have a part of our handle that's a little bit thicker than the rest of the handle. And so this is looking really nice. We can, of course, still adjust anything we want because everything is live and procedural. So I can go and select the spout spline, and again, make sure I'm in my point mode and adjust anything I want to. And then the last thing we can do is once we are done, so like every aspect of this tea kettle is done, what I like to do is keep everything nice and organized by creating a new null and double clicking on it. And let's name this kettle group. And then just clicking and dragging to get a rectangular selection, selecting all of these objects, and then just making them all children of this null. And then what we can do is once we're done modeling, we can start moving this out of the way. So if we wanted to make some cups or anything like that, we can move this out of the way, or we can go and double click on this top dot here to hide this from view. And so we can start building other types of objects. So again, if I wanted to go and create a cup, I can turn on snapping and create the profile of a cup and basically do the exact same workflow as we did before, creating the kettle. So I got this spline. I'll select all the points, Command and Control A, right click, go to create outline, and we'll add some thickness. And of course I have to go hit E to get the move tool and adjust some of this. But now we have this cup spline, and we can throw this in a lathe, and voila, we have a cup. Do the same thing up here. We can select these points, hold the shift key down to add to selection, right click, chamfer, voila, we got a rounded bit of our cup. And I can hit the 0 key to get my rectangular selection and just move this all in to make this a thinner cup. And of course, I don't need to close that spline, so I'll uncheck that so this spline's not closed. And I'll rename this cup lathe. And you can see our axis centers right down here. So I can go to axis modification, move this on up, and let's go ahead and let's group this lathe underneath a null. So Alt or Option G to group this together, and this will be cup. And so one thing I recommend you do is make sure you're done modeling your geometry before you start moving things out of the way. Because if you were to rotate this all willy-nilly like, and then you're like, oh, I actually want to adjust this spline here, and go to point mode, you can see how confusing this will be to try to adjust these spline points. So that's also why I place the object into a null as well, because if we need to get back to the original position here, I'm going to first make sure I'm in model mode. So I see my off-kilter axis here, and you can also see the coordinates here are all out of whack. We got all these rotation values. If we want to reset this to the default, we can just go down, and if you're not seeing this menu here, the coordinates menu, just click this button here, and we'll just reset transform. Now it'll bring us back to where we were from the get-go, and here is where you can go to your point mode again and start adjusting these splines here. And so again, I highly recommend that you make sure that everything's looking good before you go and start moving things in your scene once you've modeled them. So if I have a cup here and I want to create another cup, let's go and grab an instance object. And again, we used the instance object before, and this just creates a duplicate that I can move over here. And what's great about this is, remember, the instance is referencing the original object here, which is this cup group. And so I can go and select the spline, go to point mode, and if I adjust the geometry here, it'll adjust the geometry on that instance as well. So this is a super nice workflow here. So I got 2 cups, and if I click on this dot again to bring the kettle group back into my viewport view, you can now see I can go to model mode and then hit E to go to move tool, and then I can move this along the ZX plane and You can see that the cups are super huge, so I can go to my initial cup here, hit T for scale, shrink these down. Again, since this is an instance, this is also scaling down. I'll go full screen on my perspective view. And so now we're starting to get a nice little tea set. Now, one thing to mention, you can see I moved the teacup and it's also moving the instance cup. What I actually did is I moved the lathe object and not the null object. So I'm going to undo that and make sure I select the cup, null, and then move this like so. So this is also important. If I wanted to select this tea kettle and started to move this, I would only move that single lathe. So if I wanted to move the entire object, you got to make sure that you select the null and then move your object around in your viewport. Because if not, you'll just be selecting random things in your hierarchy and moving those. So just make sure you're selecting the null and then moving or rotating. All right, so here I went ahead and just built a few more objects using all the same methods that I already showed you. You can see here I created a pretty basic spoon just using an extrude object and a spline. You can see I made a tray that had some holes in it. So you can see I used a spline mask to subtract a circle from a bunch of these rounded rectangles. You can see I made a little matcha bowl using a lathe and created a lid using a lathe as well. And then the base of the tray using yet another lathe. So pretty basic stuff. But what I want to do is show you how you can make a spline that actually has some 3D depth to it. So if I wanted to create a little bit of steam curling out of this tea kettle, we can do that using a spline and then another sweep. So let's go ahead and let's go into our front view again, and let's grab our spline pen, and we'll just start by clicking and dragging here. And we'll just create a nice little curvy bit of steam here. And we can just kind of rough this out. Doesn't look that great. I'm going to hit escape and just start tweaking this. Make this look a lot nicer here. Hit escape again. Anytime it wants to try to connect there, just hit escape and you can get back to the adjustment mode here. So we'll go and adjust these points. This is where it's nice to like select in between 2 points, especially when you got a nice curvy object. And I'm gonna move this on up and adjust this ever so slightly. And so as you're doing this, it is helpful to actually throw this into a sweep object to see what this looks like. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So let's rename this Steam Spline and let's grab a sweep. And then we also need our circle spline as the profile spline. So I'll throw the circle in the sweep object first. So I'll rename this profile so we know what's what, and then drag and drop the Steam spline underneath. We need to shrink down the profile spline here, and this isn't looking too great. So if we want to add some varying thickness across the spline, we need to go to our sweep and we can rename this Steam Sweep. And remember, we can go into the details tab and adjust the scale. So let's right click, show in separate window, make this even bigger here. And we can start adjusting the spline here. So what we can do is we can zoom in and see what this looks like, because this is the beginning of the spline and this is what represents the scale of the beginning of the spline. And if we round this out like so, you can see that we got this nice little point right there. And so what we can do at this point is we can also shrink down the end of the spline. So let's go and see what's going on there. So the end of the spline, curl this up like this. And then I can command or control click to add a point and adjust this as I please as well. So we have a lot of control over the scale along the spline here. So I think that's looking good. We can also go back into our spline and start adjusting it. And again, make sure you have your spline pen selected over here as we're adjusting everything here. So I'd say that's looking pretty good. What we can also do is select the Steam Spline, go to model mode. Let's actually close out of this spline window here. And with the move tool selected, you can see where the axis center is here. Let's actually move that so it's at the base of this spline here. So I'll go into axis modification mode, and this will allow me to move this axis center right to the tip there. And I'll remember to get out of the axis modification mode here. And at this point, I can hit T for scale and scale this down and it'll scale towards that axis center. So that's an easy way to just shrink everything down. Go back to your spline pen, go back to your point mode, and you can tweak this some more as we did scale this down. So I think this is looking pretty good. And at this point, I can go to my model mode, go to my move tool, and I can start moving this into place. Now, this is where it's very helpful to have your 4-up 3D views. So right now we just have our 2 3D views. So if we want to go to our 4 view, we'll go to Panel, Arrangement, and then 4 views. And you can see that we now have 2 front views here because this used to be our top view. So let's go to this front view, go to Cameras, and change this to top. And so now we got this 4-up view of how our spline looks. And right now it's flat, just like all the other splines that we've made. So let's add some depth to the spline. So I'll select the spline, go to point mode, and what you can do is just start selecting these splines and just moving them back and forth in 3D space. So if I select this bottom point there, I can get this nice little curl to this steam. So I can hold the shift key down, add to selection, and move multiple points there. The one thing you should pay attention to is all of your views, and you want to make sure that all of your spline curves are nice and curvy in every view. So I'm just going to go into this right view and just add a little bit of curve in here. So something like that. And so it just a little bit goes a long way to add a little bit of depth. And so I'll adjust this, and then as you add some curves and 3D depth, you might have to, adjust some things because there's a little pinching going on. So I'll get into this view here and just adjust that spline point using the Bezier handles. And this is looking pretty nice and smooth. You just smell the tea, huh? Yeah, it smells really good. So we got this going for us. So let's maximize our perspective view and just kind of see how everything looks. And that's looking really nice. So this is looking awesome. I think now we can get to the point where we can kind of finish this scene. We can texture it, we can light it, and shoot off a render. So let's first go, and we've just kind of been modeling all these objects willy-nilly like, and remember that you want to be modeling things to scale. So again, we're going to go and get our little figure here, Bob the figure, and you can see how small he is. If I move this out of the way, so this is a real world scale of a 6-foot person. This is a gigantic tea set. So unless you're in Alice in Wonderland, we need to shrink down all of these objects. So what I'm going to do is select all these objects, hit T for scale. You can see I still have my little offset here. So I'm going to right click, make sure that this is just going to scale down right in the dead center there. And I'm going to shrink all this down. And I think that's about the right type of scale we should have. And then I'll just move this on down to the floor plane here. And then thank you, Bob, the figure guy. I'll delete you. And so this is created at a nice scale. So let's actually create a floor. Or if you're used to photography and studio photography, you know that there is a thing called a backdrop. And that's just really useful for really nice product photography, and we can actually find a backdrop preset if we just go and hit Shift C to bring up our commander. And this is where you can search for literally everything. And if I search for a backdrop and just type in back, you'll see there is this backdrop object. So I'm going to double click on that, and you'll see if I zoom out here, we've got this really nice backdrop, curved backdrop, that if we select this backdrop primitive object, you can adjust the rounding here. You can see that's adjusting the curve. And this is just going to be a nice little setup. Just move this forward a little bit to light and render our scene. So we got our backdrop here. Let's go ahead and start by adding some nice materials. So luckily there are some really nice preset materials if we navigate over to this asset browser. So if we click this, you can see there's all types of different presets. So there's preset models, textures, and there's this nice helpful search option here as well. And so what we can do is we can actually search and see if there is any like pottery materials. And you can see as I typed in there, it's going to filter out all of the materials that have the term pottery used to describe it. So I'm actually digging, if you want to see what this looks like even bigger, you can adjust this scale here so you can kind of see what these materials look like by their preview. And so I'm actually kind of digging this kind of material that's kind of dark and rough. So I'm going to go and click on this little cloud button. That's going to download it to my computer. And I can just go and open up the material manager here and then find that material again, click and drag and load that up into my material manager that I can start using. So let's go ahead and let's find a wood texture to use for the tray and for the lid and the spoon and some of the other elements here. So I can search for wood and let's shrink down the view here. And so you can see that there's all these wood objects as well. What I want to do is filter down just my materials. So I'm going to click on materials, and what I'm looking for is the materials that have the little Redshift icon here. So this means it's using Redshift renderer, which is what we're going to be using in this class. And these other ones are using the old renderers that will probably be phased out soon. So you want to only be choosing materials that have this little Redshift icon. So if we go and we find something that's like some light wood, like this white wood, you can see I already downloaded it, so I don't need to click that little cloud icon. So I can click and drag, bring this into my material manager as well. And let's get one white plastic material. So I'll look for plastic, and you can see here's the materials with the Redshift icons here. And I'll get the one that's kind of rough. So not the shiny one, but the rough plastic. So I'll drag and drop there. So I got 3 preset materials. I can close out of the asset browser, and now I can start applying these materials to my objects. Now, if I go and I drag and drop, say, this wood material to this spout, you'll see that the material just shows up black. And that's because I'm using Redshift materials, but in my render settings here, I'm actually rendering using standard renderer. So I need to make sure I go to my render settings, turn on Redshift, and then what that will do is switch everything over to the Redshift renderer, and then that will update the material, and you'll see the wood material in my scene like so. So I'm just going to go and start dragging and dropping the wood material onto some of the different elements in my scene here. So I'll add this to the lid, and then I'll add the plastic rough to the handle. I'll add this to the steam, and let's add the pottery material to the tea kettle, the matcha base. And then let's actually get a lighter pottery material just to contrast the dark materials there. So I'll just look for pottery again, and let's get this one. So I'll drag and drop this in. So it's just easy enough to just search for more materials and drag and drop them into your scene. I'll apply that lighter pottery material to this cup. And you'll see that I'll also apply to the instance of that teacup as well. So let's see, I'm missing the spoon. So let's add a wood material to the spoon. And then for this tray here, I'll just add the darker pottery material to that as well. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like when we render. I'm going to go to my model mode here and my move tool, just in case I want to move anything, but we'll go to our Redshift, start interactive render preview. And you'll notice that we don't have any lighting in our scene just yet. So the lighting is going to look pretty flat. So we can get really nice lighting pretty quickly by just going and grabbing yet another sun and sky rig. So if I add that to my scene, remember how this works is I can select the sky, twirl down to find the sun. I found the sun. And if I hit the R key to rotate, I can rotate the sun like so and get whatever type of lighting I want. Now it's nice to have a 45-degree angle. You don't want this to be straight on because remember this is like an onboard flash. It'll make every one of your 3D objects look flat. So we're just gonna make this kind of like an angle like that. And then we can go into our sky settings. We can adjust the intensity. And if we go down to the sun disk scale, remember the more you up this, the softer it's going to make your shadows. So I'm just going to go and create an even softer shadow, give it about a value of 7.44. And then you can go to the red blue shift and just touch this ever so slightly to the yellowish side and get just this nice warm hue to this scene. And this is looking pretty nice. Now, one thing you'll notice if I zoom in here is this lid. is kind of looking weird, and that's because our texture is kind of stretched out. Now, don't worry too much about what I'm going to show you. This is just an easy fix, and we're going to cover more about textures later on in this course. But to fix this, just click on the material here. So I'm just going to go down and change how this texture is projected onto this object. So I'm just going to choose cubic for now. It's like the Swiss Army knife there, just easily fixes things. You can see even on the lid here, it looks a little odd. So I'll go to the lid, select that material, go to projection and change this to cubic as well. And we'll see if that helps that. And that looks a lot better. And let's see what this looks like on the spoon. I think the spoon's looking pretty nice, but you can see that the material is kind of not showing up on the edge there. We're just getting the color. So on the spoon material as well, we'll go to cubic and we should see that wood grain, yep, along the side there. So I'm going to go and zoom out here. And I would say this is looking pretty good. The only thing I might change is making this backdrop a little bit darker, because white on white, we're kind of losing the detail there. Everything's kind of blending into one another. So what we can do is create a new material by going to this plus sign, holding it down, going to materials and adding a new standard material. And let's go ahead and apply this directly to the object in the viewport. You can see now we have that material tag applied to this backdrop as well. If we select this Redshift standard material, I can double click this and rename this backdrop. And if I go to the base properties tab, this is all of your base properties. So your color, your reflection. Let's actually just bring down the reflection altogether. So we can bring the weight down so there's zero reflection whatsoever. And then for the color, I can change the color chip here. And let's actually maybe make this a little bit darker and give it like a little tan hue. And you can see a little bit goes a long way, just making this pop off our background a little bit. Let's actually see what this looks like. Maybe just a little bit of gray. I think adding a little bit of hue helps there a little bit. And so you can see that this is just adding a little bit of contrast between these white elements and the backdrop. So I'm digging that. And let's go ahead and let's create a camera. So I'll go to the camera menu, add a standard camera. Make sure we're looking through it by clicking this little viewfinder icon. And you can see now we're looking through it and we can kind of choose what angle we want. And we can also flatten out this view a little bit and remove perspective by increasing the focal length. So this is going to turn this into a long lens. So you can see that just zoomed in. So I'm just going to hit the 2 key and click and drag to zoom out here. And this will zoom our camera out. But I just like how this looks a little bit more flat as far as the composition goes. And so this is looking pretty nice. So let's go ahead and let's render this. So I'm going to go to my render settings and we're going to choose the file path that we want to render in. So let's just render, I'll render this as test, and then I'll change the format to a PNG, 18-bit, so we get more color information. And then the output tab, we'll just say, just render the current frame here. And we can also change this to say, 1920, and I'll tab twice to go down to the height and enter 1920 there as well. And so now we got a square composition. And once we recompose our shot here, looking good, we can go and render. So once we are done composing our shot, we can go and click and hold on this clapper button with the play icon and go to render to picture viewer. And this will then render our image to our file path that we set there, and the name of our file will be whatever this is here.
And this is where we do the fast forward voice.
So this might be a little bright as it's rendering, but once it finishes, it is going to look exactly like the viewport view here. There you go. You can see it just adapted the color space there. And if you want to see where this lives on your computer, just right click on that PNG and then go to show file in Explorer or Finder. And there you go. There is your image. You can double click on it and that'll open it up. You can print this out, throw it up on your fridge, and you can say, hey, this was my render. I did this all by myself. Look at how far I'm coming in just a single week. Place in the world is, and it can't